helping coordinate this. This is joint work with Raghuram Rajan and one of my PhD students, Jack Shim, who's graduating this year. It is an extension of some work that Raghu and I had done before before sort of his central banking stint started. We had been thinking about what creates debt capacity for governments, even if, we kind of more or less understand that they are not always using the proceeds of the debt necessarily in the best interests of the country or the sovereign. But I think this is we have a lot more going on in what I'm going to show you today. And what we are after and what we are most excited about is this result that myopic, self-interested governments, when they have access to debt markets, in particular external debt markets, they could, in certain conditions, which I'll try and spell out, and I think those conditions will be interesting to think about in context of Asia, Latin America, etc. But the key point is that it can lead to a growth trap where even your steady state outcomes for the economy never improve and are far short of, let's call it, a situation without this government having access to debt, for example. And it happens because we are going to show that myopic and self-interested governments who are focused on raising more and more debt in order to undertake their expenditures, they could have repressive incentives. They would have incentives to channel the savings of the economy towards the government bond markets. And as they do that, it will also be a form of economic repression. They will be repressing the channeling of these savings into private investments. And each successive government wants to keep this going on, and you may never actually come out of suboptimal growth levels. This may not always be the case. As I said, this will happen under certain conditions, and therefore it's interesting to think about when does giving access to debt to a myopic, self-interested government, whom we are going to call as an ODS government, lead to debt itself being the source of the problem, which is that it's going to be, when does giving debt to such a government lead to repression ad infinitum, and then you get a growth trap. So this question is, of course, not new. It has been analyzed, I would say, reasonably often in the literature as to whether external government borrowing is good for the economy or not. Now, in the standard literature, there are many ways to model the benefits of external debt. The most common form that it takes is that opportunities or shocks arise idiosyncratically across countries, and sovereign debt markets become a way to share risks from one country to the other. There are also cases, there are some cases in which you have intertemporal consumption smoothing because households don't have access to the debt markets to produce this, to do the smoothing on their own. And then the sovereign debt market becomes a way of doing this intertemporal consumption smoothing. Now, what is notable about this literature is that by and large, in fact, almost always, the governments are modeled as sort of what one might call as benevolent central planners of our models. There is some market imperfection or a market failure, and the government essentially is able to use the debt markets to ameliorate the market failure in some way. But as we were discussing just before I started, there is now literature smaller than the first one that argues that debt could in fact be odious if the government that has access to this debt market is in fact bad in its objectives. Now, what this literature, notably in the legal scholarship, Boucher, Gulati, Thompson, and Jayachandra and Kramer, I think it was the paper by Kramer that was being referred to earlier, they view that when you have truly bad, maybe even governments that are actually killing their citizens, or maybe they're just outright corrupt, that citizens should not be held responsible for legacy debt issued by these governments, because this debt really served the purpose of these corrupt governments, and it is too much of a burden. You should let the investors bear these costs. And there is some literature following on that says, oh, but clearly we can't just write off debts that easily. Debt defaults are costly. Citizens would bear some costs of not making repayments at some point or the other. And so essentially, it's we don't want to take an ideological stand on this issue. We think that the question should really be answered in the context of some functional theory of sovereign debt that helps understand why and when giving access to debt, even when the governments are not perfect, could lead to very bad outcomes. And then what are some instruments or policies that could help address the negative consequences of debt in that case. Now, I just want to point out that this question may be important to model theoretically, because empirically, it has been very hard for the literature in international finance to find a positive relationship between foreign borrowing and growth in the context of developing countries. So Eisenman, Pinto, and Radziwill, Prasad, Rajan, and Subramanian, and there's some work by Pierre-Olivier Gurinsha as well. They call it the allocation puzzle, that it seems that these countries are able to borrow, so foreign money goes to them, but there's no tangible impact that can be discovered in data on their growth. So I just want to say this. I am going to come back to the evidence and why, what our model has to say about how to rationalize why this relationship may be hard to tease out the way this literature has gone about teasing it out. So essentially, given this backdrop, we wanted to develop a dynamic theory of sovereign debt with a government that is not as odious as in the Balachandran and Kramer view of the world, or Boucher, Gulati, and view of the world, but one that is still bad in the sense that it's myopic. So it's focused only on stuff during its own term, and it's entirely wasteful in its expenditures, which is that it's self-interested and spends on pet projects, or it spends on subsidies or revenue expenditures for its vote bank, which don't add up to much in terms of growth for the economy as a whole. Now, arguably, this is a very strong assumption. And if there's time, I'll talk a little bit about what happens if we give the myopic government. So suppose you keep the horizon as myopic, but you give the government access to some useful technology such as infrastructure. Will they really go ahead and do anything about it? And just as a prelude, what's going to be key is that the myopia is going to be quite crucial in our assumption. Because once the government horizons are myopic, if the cash flows from even productive investments such as infrastructure come down the line, and if they can't borrow against it fully, then they will heavily underinvest in such technologies. I'll hopefully can show that, or we can discuss it later on. My own view is that this is not, I personally think this is actually a perfect caricature of what governments are. I think governments are entirely myopic. They are only self-interested, in my view, to the extent that what they want to achieve produces outcomes that are good for the economy. I think things work out well. And I think that's what the model is about. When do things work out well, in spite of this being the political economy, and when do things not really work out well?
So do you identify government then with a political party, or is government something different from that in terms of an administrative government that does various things? So this interpretation of the government is pretty much a political party kind of interpretation, right?
Yeah, so we will have a party kind of an interpretation. I think not so much about anything specific in that sense, but we have in mind that they have to keep running for elections on a regular basis. And so they want to do stuff that is simply wasteful. Now, there are two ways of interpreting wasteful. One is the pure odious debt view, which is that these guys are just corrupt and they are siphoning out the cash flows. I think the model is the closest to that. But you could even imagine that, there could be a small vote bank from which they gain benefits on the margin, or it could be, some cronies who are helping them divert the funds through so-called expenditures, but it's ultimately going into their pockets in some way or the other. You end up helping these cronies in the process, but from the standpoint of the economy, it was relatively wasteful. Why were you helping the cronies? Maybe they are giving you private jets for your election campaigns or whatever. So we don't have in. So essentially, we are not going to model the election. We are not going to model a rich political economy of all this. We are just going to assume that whoever you choose, ultimately they come to power and they are endowed with these perverse objectives, that their horizon is only till the next term, and they are only interested in siphoning to the extent that they can pull it off.
Can I ask a follow-up question? My name is Somanathan.
Yes, yes. Hi.
Hi. So I suppose that you're thinking of the debt as being some access to funds at the margin. So you're not modeling what they do with the tax revenue.
No, we will actually model the tax revenues. In fact, that is the channel through which repression will be happening in our model. Repression in our model is going to just look like high tax on private investments, because the government wants to channel those into the debt markets, and the government will recognize that if they tax too much, the tax revenues themselves shrink because the private investment collapses a lot, and therefore, they won't tax beyond a certain level.
Okay.
So the government will do its spending from two components: the debt that it can raise, which is essentially a claim on future taxes that other governments will collect, and the taxes that they can raise in their term itself. Both of those will be part of their spending budget.
Okay. I guess it's going to matter a lot, right, in terms of the substantive implications of what the time horizon is. Because if you're myopic within, say, a 5-year term, you can still make a lot of investments because they mature, you can produce returns within the term.
You're right. Right. Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think to the extent that some of what they can invest in, they can reap the benefits of right away, they will internalize those gains. I think that's perfectly right. Yeah. But my own experience is that even 4 or 5 years is actually not that long, because there are midterm elections along the way, there are state elections along the way, and so invariably, it's not that your entire term is sort of available for you to do the stuff. And you could even argue that maybe what they really care about is their popularity numbers, and those polls are happening all the time. And as long as they are driven by these polls, there'll be some extent of catering to their vote banks. But as I said, I'm going to assume more extremely that they are just siphoning off the money, basically. And then maybe the issues you raise, which is, are some of the gains accruing in their term, become more relevant. I think that's absolutely right. I think in a way, what we are saying is that private investment generates some returns to the economy. Now, let me just backtrack a little bit on that, though, which is that as I was responding on the point on tax revenues, they will recognize that some of the private investment that happens in their term, they can collect taxes from. So it's not that they are completely ignoring the fact that supporting growth, even during their own term, actually has good news for them. They will internalize this, but they will do much more in certain cases. They will tax private investments even more than this, recognizing that their tax collections are coming down, but there will be a rationale for them to actually channel the savings by reducing private investments into the domestic bond market, and you will see how they model that. Well, maybe we can come back to some of these questions as I present the model, because then it'll be a lot more formal. So the question we then ask is, does giving such a government access to external debt affect the decisions of such a government? We will compare steady state outcomes. There are models in which altering the objective functions of governments leads to slowdown in the path of convergence to the steady state, but doesn't affect the steady state. Instead, we are going to show that actually you could have growth traps, possibly, where you never come out of a repressive, high indebtedness outcome with myopic, self-interested governments. And in those situations, an ODS government will imply ODS debt, but not always so, as I mentioned. Okay. So our key result is that it depends. The one thing that goes against ODS government necessarily implying ODS debt is that, of course, debt is a claim on future taxes. And to this extent, an ODS government, if it wants to spend more by borrowing, will recognize that if I do the right thing for the economy in the long run, the future tax revenues will go up, and perhaps the debt markets will be willing to lend to me against these future taxes. Now, when this is so, debt can lengthen the effective horizon even of a myopic government. In fact, lack of access to debt, so lack of financial development, will in fact produce nothing else than a very myopic outcome. However, the key point is, will the credit markets be willing to lend to you against your entire future stream of taxes that you collect? And this depends upon whether you have commitment to repay. If future governments will have commitment to repay the debt, then you can keep borrowing against the entire future stream of cash flows. But one property of poor economies is going to be that in general, they are going to have strategic incentives not to repay the debt. And in particular, we will show that when economies are poor, so they have low endowments, and if their households are also saving very little, then even debt will not be able to lengthen the horizon. Worse, access to debt will now actually produce outcomes that are worse than without having access to debt. The citizens in poor economies that save little will be worse off in the long run in the presence of debt markets for a myopic government without any constraints on their borrowing. And I think for someone like me who's from India, and I think I like this result a lot. In macro in India, economists talk a lot about the savings rate and the propensity of households to save. They worry a lot when the savings rates are falling down. And if you talk to former RBI deputy governors and governors, they say that one of the reasons why they worried about is that if savings rates go low, then there is no choice but to repress in the economy to keep the debt markets for the government going at reasonable borrowing costs. And I think we will have a very specific result on this. Effectively, what's going to happen is that when households are consuming a lot and not saving much, essentially the benefits of growth enhancing policies don't actually accrue in future because not much savings is taking place. And then this horizon lengthening effect of debt markets is going to actually not be that powerful. So essentially, put another way, when households save more, the households are actually very long-term in their planning because they are trying to build endowment for the long run rather than consuming more. And this long horizon of the households acts as an antidote to the myopia of the government. Because if they are saving a lot, then the government today can undertake policies which will generate higher endowments down the line. Then future governments can actually collect taxes on those and repay the debts that they have. And in anticipation, the credit markets will be willing to actually lend to you today. And so, you will see that in the model, this household propensity to save will actually play a very crucial role. Put yet differently, when household propensity to save is also little, even their horizons are in that sense not too long term. And then you get a very toxic combination of a myopic government with access to debt that wants to channel this period savings into the bond markets, and you will get sort of very bad outcomes for growth. So what can the model explain? On the one hand, we think it explains why you get persistently slow growth in developing economies that become very heavily indebted. And we think it also explains the lack of growth and debt relationship in data, because some of the governments which are going to be borrowing a lot are in fact also going to be the ones that are going to be following very repressive policies. So high debt levels may not necessarily imply high growth, because these governments are borrowing more through very repressive mechanisms in the economy. And then we will do some shock, kind of unexpected shock analysis, sort of MIT style shock analysis, to see if you get a large shock like a global financial crisis or a COVID-19 shock, how should debt be restructured? Can even developed economies with a large enough endowment shock switch from a region in which debt was lengthening their horizons to a region in which debt becomes very repressive in the sense of government policies?
Excuse me, can I ask one quick
Yeah,
question? So given the second point in the last slide, then why is it that large debts are made available to these governments in the first place?
Because what's going to happen is that through repression, they manage to generate enough domestic savings into the government bond markets rather than into the private sector investments. And as they do that, the bond market develops and it becomes hard to default on the debt. So, if you have a debt default, you will get problems in interbank markets, you will get problems in repo markets, etc. And so what these governments do is that they develop their domestic bond markets and then repress the savings of the economy through the banks or other financial institutions such as insurance companies or pension funds, etc. They will channel the savings into the domestic bond market. And that will give commitment to the external investors that, these governments are not going to default on this debt because they will have a big banking crisis of their own. After all, the banks, insurance companies, pension funds are holding so much government debt. There will be a chaotic disorder in these markets when the default happens. So essentially, that's going to be the mechanism through which commitment to repay is going to be built in this model, which is that you entangle your debt with your financial sector and you do more of it in order to actually give commitment to external investors that you won't just run away from making your repayments the first time you have to make a repayment. Now, essentially, this is a channel of debt commitment that was started by a paper in AER by Bronner and Ventura. They basically said that, this idea that you can selectively default on foreign debt is not very compelling, because the moment the foreign investors get a whiff of this, they will essentially dump the debt onto the domestic institutions. And once they do that, you are really left with no opportunity to default in the first place. Now you have to have a domestic default, and that's going to be pretty painful to undertake as well. In fact, this mechanism has become like, there's a paper by Patrick Bolton and Olivier Jean where they actually model the interbank markets. We are not going to do that. We are going to model default costs in a very reduced form manner. But they actually model interbank market where the government debt serves as a useful collateral role. But the flip side is that this makes it hard for the government to default on the debt. And in anticipation, external creditors are willing to keep the tap on because the stock of commitment is getting endogenously built. So, but I think this is going to be a key mechanism in the model, which is that what the governments do when they repress is that they entangle more of the domestic savings with the government bond market. that on the one hand gives external investors greater commitment about the repayment, so they keep the tap going. But the point is that the government is doing it for, given its conflicted objective, it's doing it to borrow more and do wasteful expenditures. And therefore, this is going to be costly for the economy as a whole.
Okay, so that will keep the engine running in some sense.
Yeah, they'll keep the engine running, and only up to the point that external investors have commitment that you will make the
Yeah.
repayment.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank
So
you.
those are going to be the key calculations in the model, which is how much will the external investors fund the government given the size of the domestic entanglement of savings with the bond market. So this is going to be a key calculation that we have to do. And what that's going to do is it's going to then affect the policies of the government. They're going to choose endogenously how much to produce this kind of entanglement of the savings with my bond markets. And they're going to do it through repression, basically. So repression is a device here to basically commit to external investors that I'll repay your debt in future.
Okay.
Okay, so it's going to be an infinite horizon model with discrete time. Each time period is basically like an election term, as we have been discussing. We're going to model a small open economy. It has a going interest rate of R, which is same as the world interest rate, and it's going to borrow in we're going to assume it's just borrowing in the domestic currency. We don't have currency consequences in the model. There's a nice paper by Du and Schreger who show that even actually defaulting on foreign debt is not that easy for countries, because when they do that, that could lead to collateral damage on the domestic corporations, because they might also be borrowing abroad, and there could be consequences of defaulting on foreign currency debt as well. We'll model the households in an overlapping generation structure. This is not to say that the household lives and dies at each election term. It's just a modeling trick. What we are trying to do through the overlapping generation structure is to introduce this propensity to save, which is how much do they care about the current term consumption versus building the endowment for the future. So if you want that savings term in a richer utility function than what we have, could be interpreted as your intertemporal elasticity of substitution, for example. Each government will be incumbent only for one period. We are not going to model the elections. We are just going to assume that when the period ends, a new government comes to power, but they only care about the expenditures in their current term. And in the extreme, these expenditures are wasteful. They don't add anything to the growth of the economy, other than for some accounting purposes as to how much activity happened. It doesn't have any long run consequences for the growth of the economy. Households can invest in foreign or domestic government debt. In fact, that will be the only financial instrument that we will allow them access to. And we'll assume that as long as the domestic debt markets are open, because defaults have not taken place, etc., the household will have a mild home bias and they will invest in the domestic debt. Of course, there's a huge literature that shows that such home bias is in place. But this is not the repression. The repression is not that the households are investing in domestic government debt. Repression is going to be about how much they are investing in the government debt. So what is the objective function of the households? So each household inherits some endowment EI from the previous term, so from the previous generation, and they will maximize utility over current consumption, and they have a bequest motive over what they leave behind as the future endowment EI plus one. And in order to get tractability, we're going to assume logarithmic preferences over consumption as well as over this bequest motive. Okay, so and you will see that there's a parameter rho on the bequest motive, and that's going to be the propensity to save of the household. So when rho is high, in a way, this is a very long-term household. It cares about its endowments in the long run. When rho is low, they put relatively greater weight on their immediate consumption. As I said, households have one financial investment they can make, which is that they can invest an amount SI in the domestic bonds, and they will get the going rate of interest. But they can also make real investments. We are not modeling money or anything. So everything, this is just a real model. They can make a real investment KI and it will generate F of KI at the end of the period, which they can either choose to consume or they can put it into the future endowment. And we assume certain regularity conditions on F of K to ensure our steady states, etc., exist. We get fixed point theorems work and so on. But for all practical purposes, this is going to mean that some sort of standard power function like K to the power gamma will satisfy these conditions. And we need that to ensure the solutions are well behaved.
Viral, can I ask a quick question? So typically the savings, the stock of savings is linked to the capital stock through a capital market clearing condition, right? So, but here that's not happening. So there's financial savings that is separate from something else that households are investing in, like K. Is that right?
Yeah.
So K determines output, S is something else.
Yeah, we're basically just marrying the household and the private sector into a single sector, basically. So it's not that the net of that is what goes into the domestic government bond market. So if you want, you can introduce an intermediary in between, which takes KI from the households and puts and lends it to the corporate sector. The corporate sector then generates F of KI. And the assumption here is that the households or the intermediaries are expropriating the entire F of KI in the process. So if you had an intermediary in between, you could possibly get some other interesting effects going on, which is, does repression affect the cost of lending to the private sector, for example? But we don't have, is that what you have in mind, Chetan?
Yeah, okay. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we don't have that sort of friction. So financial repression here is going to be just a one-for-one tax on real investments. In reality, there could be a competition based on the rate of interest. And then I'll talk a little bit more about this. Yeah. Okay, so the key is, what is the government objective? It's myopic, so it only cares about its one period spending. And as I mentioned upfront in response to one of the questions, what does this mean? This means that they have two components in their spendables. The spendables of a government are the new debt it can raise and the tax revenues that it can collect in its term. Okay, we're going to assume that the debt has the horizon basically of the same as the term. It is not very restrictive as to whether it's a long-term debt or not. We actually discuss in the paper why long-term debt would lead to pretty much very similar outcomes. Now, they don't, however, spend everything that is available as spendables. And why is that? Because if they choose not to default on the legacy debt DI minus 1, then a part of the spendables, which is DI plus tax revenues, will be exhausted in repaying the past debt. If they choose to default, however, then of course the entire spendable becomes available for spending, but there will be another cost that you have to keep in account, which is the default costs from not repaying the legacy debt. Okay, so we're going to assume that there are some reputational costs. So there'll be some fixed costs of undertaking a sovereign default. There could also be some other implications. But the key assumption is going to be that these default costs will also depend on the size of the domestic bond market, because it's going to be like a disruption of the repo market, damage to the banking sector, and so on. We'll assume that once a government defaults for one term, they are cut out, they are shut out from the borrowing markets. We don't need to assume that they are shut out forever. So our model would in principle fit well like the situation of Argentina, which was converted 9 times now over the last century. But why is the possibility? So what's going to happen is the model is deterministic. There's never going to be a default in the equilibrium path in the model other than when we have these unexpected shocks. But why is the default crucial? The default is crucial because strategic defaults are going to be possible, because the governments want in some cases to rather, in fact, if you think about a typical sovereign default, if you think about what kind of headlines are in Argentina when default is being considered. It's about why are we using the tax collections to repay the legacy debts which are held by outsiders? Why don't we use it to undertake the spending right now, right? That is exactly the classic strategic default calculation, saving it for spending internally rather than paying outside. The difference here is that the spending is beneficial only to the local government or a specific part of the vote bank, as I've been mentioned. Okay.
So Viral,
Yeah.
Moni here. I have a question here.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
you have this beta, and depending on that beta, there'll be some general equilibrium effects too, right? If my beta is very high, then your capital will be higher, saving will be higher, capital will be higher, and therefore the rate of interest will be low. So do you capture that general equilibrium effects through your choice of beta in this problem too?
You mean rho or?
Rho, sorry.
Rho, yeah. No, we don't have anything determining the rate of interest in the model actually. So as I said, we are taking this to be a small open economy where the interest rate is actually the same as the going world interest rate. But I think both the channel that you are referring to and the channel that Chetan mentioned, perhaps of the intermediation channel of savings going through banks to the private sector for its investments. I think this would be very nice extensions to consider in the model, because in a way our modeling of repression is sort of very brute force. It just has a very direct one-for-one mapping in reducing the private sector investments. It would be nice to actually see what are the implications of these for interest rate and like government interest rate and for the real interest rate through the marginal rate of investments and so on, which would play a role if you modeled an intermediation sector that was more meaningful.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so because this strategic default is possible, what matters is not just the ability of the future government to pay. So what matters is not just whether they have future taxes that are high enough, but what also matters is how high are the default costs. Because if default costs are high, then higher debt repayments will be made in equilibrium, because that will be the more incentive compatible decision for the governments. And so the willingness to pay matters as well. Okay, so let me first specify the default cost structure and then write down this ability to pay, willingness to pay constraints, combine them, and then restate what the objective of the government looks like. Okay, so we're going to model the cost of default. The first term is standard. There's some fixed cost of default, capital C. You need that to get sort of any repayments being made in these sovereign debt models, because creditors have no access to any government collateral, unlike a corporate bankruptcy. So the only commitment comes from these costs of default, the reputational or whatever other costs are. But it's the second term which is going to be the more important term, which is that a cost of sovereign default is going to be proportional to the size of the domestic bond market. Okay, so DI-1 domestic is the legacy debt DI-1, which is held in the form of domestic savings, and 1 plus R is just the repayment on that. So that's the total payment, and there's a multiplier Z on top of that. So if to put another way, like I sometimes give the US analogy here. So suppose that the stock of debt is 10 trillion, and you have a US debt ceiling becoming a technical default problem. It says that the disruption in the bond markets will be so large that the loss of welfare will actually exceed that amount of 10 trillion by a factor Z greater than 1. What this means is that up to an amount capital C plus Z times the domestic savings, debt will always be repaid, and therefore that's going to pin down the extent of external debt that will be provided by foreign investors under the assumption of no default. Okay, if they provide more than these default costs, there is no willingness to pay that debt. In equilibrium, of course, therefore that debt will not get repaid. Okay, and what is this Z greater than 1? It's basically a very, very reduced form way of modeling collateral damage to payment systems, interbank markets, repo markets, etc., resulting in a complete financial chaos or catastrophe for the government. If you want, these are mop-up costs that you will result in a run on your banks, and then in order to fix your banking system, you'll have to incur a cost that's actually larger than the size of the domestic bond markets in the process. I actually find this a very compelling reason why debt gets repaid. In fact, many times governments in the end care about these. Even if you looked at the US debt ceiling problem, you could argue that the willingness to repay there was more sort of a political gridlock. Nevertheless, it would have been a strategic default. US didn't have an ability to repay problem at the time of the debt ceiling crisis. But in the end, there were op-eds coming out from financial economists in the FT and so on, saying that, listen, ultimately you're going to be inflicting a huge damage on the domestic economy itself through this lack of debt rollovers. And at least I'm told that privately, these were the conversations that the bankers were having with the governments. And this is what ultimately led to the two parties agreeing to relax the debt ceiling and borrow further. Now, I'm not saying whether that was the right thing to do or not. I'm just saying that these domestic collateral damage costs are important when a sovereign defaults on its debt. In the context of Argentina, etc., what happens, of course, is that savers start worrying about the banks, and the savings actually start going into foreign banks. So you can just have a complete exodus of currency itself, and with huge depreciation outcomes. So then what is the government policy? The government policy is going to be very simple. It's going to tax the real sector at some tax rate TI. We'll assume that the taxation is distorted, so it's not just some lump sum taxation. And they will collect some tax revenues from this, which are going to be the tax rate T times the f of k, where k itself is a function of the tax rate, because the households will anticipate they will only invest factoring in their post-tax returns from investments. So in the model, because we have merged the households and the private sector into a single sector, and because we are not considering any separate interest rates, etc., this one tool, this one policy maps one for one into economic repression and financial repression. Okay, if you tax the real sector on investments more, that creates more domestic savings. You can imagine a richer model in which you would need financial repression. As I said, for example, even if not modeling anything else, even if households had a richer utility function with a difference between their sort of log function simplifies things so that essentially when they don't invest, everything just goes into savings. In a richer utility function, you would need to break this linkage, and you would need both economic and financial repression. Effectively, what is going to be key in the model is that when you channel the savings into government bonds, this is costly for the long run growth of the economy. And for that, you need to have some impact on the investment. And I think that is what is really crucial. Okay, so the model timeline is as follows. I've gone through most of this. At the beginning of a time period, a newly incumbent government has some legacy debt, and then it will decide whether to default on this debt or not. And the government will announce a tax rate TI, which will depend on whether it has chosen to default on the debt or not. And given all these, the households decide on their savings and investments. These investments produce taxes for the government at the end. And if they've chosen not to default, they will repay the debt. And then, some new domestic holdings of legacy debt come about for the next period government to inherit. The households would have done some savings, they have made investments, and so their endowment is then enters the next period based on the calculation that I had shown earlier. So the household problem is relatively straightforward. This is just a bunch of equations that pin down investment, future endowment, consumption, and savings. There are two parts that are crucial. But the first one is from the first equation, that as tax rate T increases, the private investment K declines. Okay, so that's sort of straightforward, and we need that. The second equation is the law of motion for the state variable. In fact, this is going to be the only state variable, the endowment of the economy. There's the law of motion for that. And it has two components that are important. One is that as long as investments are positive net present value, making investments would have added to the future endowment of the economy. And second, though, that this parameter rho is going to play a crucial role, which is that the more the households are saving, the higher will be the future endowments of these economies. And conversely, from the third equation, the higher is the rho, the lower is going to be the consumption that is undertaken in each period. Okay. One piece of notation is that in autarky, so when there is no debt, the government only have tax revenues as their spendables. So they will simply maximize T times F of K of T, and we'll denote that tax rate as T double star and the corresponding tax revenues as tau double star. Okay, so now we have to pin down the government choice. So to do that, we need to see how their spendables are affected by the ability to pay and the willingness to pay on the debt. So just to recall, the spendables are, I'm going to denote it as capital S, and how much the current government can borrow is going to be based on whether the debt will be repaid by the next period government. So the calculation that the external investors have to do in lending to the current government is what is the ability to pay and the willingness to repay of the next period government. Okay, therefore I'm doing the calculations for I+1. Now the next period governments will face an ability to pay constraint, and therefore external investors today will lend only up to a total amount DI between the domestic and the foreign amounts, such that that times 1 plus R is smaller than the total spendables of the next period government. Okay, because the next period government cannot repay beyond the new debt it can raise and the taxes that it can collect. Okay, and this is now, you can see, if you keep now substituting for DI plus 1 in this equation, then DI plus 1 is going to depend on the spendables of the next period government. Now, what do those depend on? Those depend on the debt that can be issued by the successive governments and the taxes that they can collect. So in infinity, as long as you are in the ability to pay region, so there is no question of strategic defaults, debt basically just becomes a borrowing against the entire stream of future taxes that can be collected. Okay, but what's the problem? The problem is that you may not be able to borrow up to that entire stream of future cash flows because there's a possibility of strategic default. So what is the strategic constraint? The strategic constraint is that if the next period government does not repay the legacy debt, if it repays the legacy debt, then what is the spending that it can undertake? The spending that it can undertake is the total spendables, which is the new debt plus the taxes minus the repayments on legacy debt. And on the right-hand side, you have the spending in case of a default. Now, once they default, they can't borrow for the term. So they can only generate spendables now collapse to the domestic tax revenues. So those are the tau double star. But they have to mop up the banking sector. They have to clean up the defaults, and that's going to cost them capital C plus Z times SI, which is the domestic default. Okay, so the incentive compatibility constraint for the next period government not to default is therefore that the debt DI not exceed this quantity on the right-hand side in the equation at the bottom, okay, which is the spendables of the next period government, but reduced by an amount which is the revenues in autarky minus the deadweight costs of default. And why is this? So you can see here that what the deadweight costs of default do is that they basically keep increasing the stock of debt that can be raised, because that's the commitment that you have to repay the debt. but the government can collect taxes and spend even in autarky. And so to that extent, the debt capacity gets reduced, and you will not be able to always borrow up to the full spendable amount in the ability to pay region. Okay. Now you can combine the constraints, and then you basically get that the DI, which is how much the current government can borrow, is constrained by the ability to pay, which is the first term, but potentially also by the willingness to pay, which is the second term. Okay, so once the default costs exceed the autarkic tax revenues, you enter the ability to pay region. Until that, you are in the willingness to pay region, and you are not able to borrow up to the entire stream of future cash flows. Now, this is
I will just
go ahead.
Just to let you know, we've got about 10 minutes left. So
10 minutes. Okay. Yeah, that's good. So I think I'll be able to highlight the key channel very soon. So this helps illustrate the double-edged sword nature of debt, which is that on the one hand, the debt is going to be increasing in the domestic savings, which are going to be increasing in the tax rate. As you increase the tax rate, there's less investment and there's more domestic savings that builds the stock of default costs and allows you to borrow more. On the other hand, increasing the tax rate is going to reduce the endowments in future periods. And through that, it is going to reduce the future stock of commitment that those governments have and reduce the spendables and the repayment capacity of that government. Okay, so there is one horizon lengthening motive, and then there is one repressive motive, which is to simply raise the stock of repayments now. Okay, so the government will trade this off, and then it will determine what it wants to do, what policy it wants to choose, default or no default. If no default, then what taxation to choose, and then that will pin down the debt that can be raised. So you can set up this problem recursively, assuming that there will never be a default in equilibrium because investors will never lend to you in a deterministic model beyond that amount. And so in the Bellman equation, you can show that the only variable that matters is really this endowment of the economy at any given point of time. So the key property of the model is the following, that as the endowment of the economy increases as a state variable, the government spendables increase. And in the most interesting parameterization of the model, the tax rate has the following property on the right-hand side, which is that at low endowments, you are in the willingness to pay region and the tax rates are very high. You have repressive tax rates. In the middle region of endowments, you are sliding from the willingness to pay to the ability to pay. So both constraints bind, and the tax rates now decline as endowment increases, and they finally reach the T double star tax rate, which is in this case 35% once you enter the ability to pay region. Okay, but this is basically a function of the endowment of the economy, because the richer the economy is, the more is the pool of domestic savings, the greater is the commitment not to distort the domestic financial sector, and therefore the repayments will be anticipated to happen without reducing the stock of debt. Okay, so essentially I'm going to call these regions as WTP, WTP and ATP, that's the sliding region, and the ATP, which is the sort of, if you want, like the perfect steady state in which you converge to high endowment eventually. Now, the key question is, where does the economy end up in the steady state? So as the, say the economy starts out at an endowment of 0.25, suppose. Does it escape as you simulate the model for an infinite horizon? Does it ever escape the willingness to pay region, or it gets trapped there? If it starts at 1.5, does it eventually go into the higher endowment region where the debt stock is only constrained by ability to pay, and therefore you get low non-repressive tax rates coming about? And so to do that, we need to analyze the steady states. So what is a steady state? A steady state is one in which the tax policy of the government at a given endowment EI leads to a future endowment which is the same as the current endowment. Okay, so that's straightforward. Now, in this model, it turns out that in general, there are steady states in each of these three regions in general. You could have a steady state in the willingness to pay region, so you are just trapped there. You have a steady state in the middle region, which is the sliding region, and you are trapped there. or you have a steady state in the rightmost, which is sort of like the ability to pay or the good steady state. Now, importantly, this creates there a possibility of multiple steady states for the primitive parameters of the model. And what that means, what do the multiple steady states mean? It means that which steady state you will end up in depends upon the starting endowment of the economy. Okay. In particular, there will be growth traps in which if you start out at a low endowment, you are never able to reach the ability to pay region, even though that is a possible steady state of the model if somehow the economy was made rich and its endowment was actually at a much higher state. The endowments are never able to increase to a level such that you can converge to a steady state that's actually the better one. So let me just give a quick intuition for this trap, which is like the key one we want to focus on, which is that the excess to debt worsens the steady state relative to the benchmark. Why? Because the government of a low endowment economy has a strong incentive to repress the real economy. They don't have much future stock of endowments to build any commitment around. They say, we need to give confidence to the investors that we are getting the banks to invest in the bonds right now. So they suppress growth, they suppress the private investment. But as they do this, the economy is not able to become rich in the next period because you killed the private sector in order to keep your bond market going. Now, as you killed the private sector, the economy is not rich at the time of the next government either, and they repeat the behavior all over again. They repress the economy as well, and then you're basically trapped forever. Now, this was a result we did not necessarily anticipate when we wrote down the model, but I think it's a very, if I could say it, I think it's a very cool result because it actually, because in most models that I have seen in international macro, when you get this, when you model the government distortions, you get a slowdown in the path of convergence to the goods, to the only good steady state. But here there are multiple steady states. And if the economy is poor, it never sometimes manages to escape the trap. So let me just show this visually. What happens is that there are two steady states here, as you see in the very far right, say at 80 periods. One is a steady state A, which is achieved when endowment is high and ability to pay tax rates will apply. And then there's a steady state W in which the endowment is low. And what you get in the model is that if your starting endowment is below 2, you always converge to the steady state, which is the bad one. Whereas at the endowments which are above, you converge to the better steady state. Okay, so now the question is what determines that you will end up in this growth trap region? And the main result is that it depends upon the household propensity to save. Okay, if the households are not saving much, in particular, if their household saving parameter rho, we have this nice result that if it's less than 1 over the autarkic tax rate, which is in the ability to pay region, then you will get traps, and then the debt is truly odious with these bad governments that are out there. The intuition is simple. Basically, when the households save a lot, the future endowments of the economy grow quickly. And why is it important that the governments care about the future? Because if they can have the commitment of future governments to repay the debt, they will choose lower taxes, boost their tax revenues, and that way be able to borrow more from the external creditors. If the future governments are not going to be left with a bigger pie as well, then they just go for the kill in the current period, and then they trap the economy forever through successive repressions. Okay, so just to summarize, debt basically can be a double-edged sword. Horizons can get lengthened, but debt can also encourage myopic governments to repress the real economy in order to do this channeling into the bonds. We think that this perhaps explains, like if you talk to Dr. Rakesh Mohan, former deputy governor of RBI, he always says that the reason why Asian economies grew a lot is because actually the households were saving a lot. And you contrast that with Latin American economies where, I don't think the governments in Asian economies are terribly different in my view from those in Asia. So at least one possible driver could be that the Latin American economies have saved little. Now, we are not asking the deeper question of why certain economies save more than others. Maybe those are also things that the governments can influence themselves. Okay, let me just make one quick last point before I take some final questions. Now, one of the exercises we do is what happens if you get large shocks. So suppose that you are a poor economy stuck in the steady state W, which is, the growth trap. And you get a large shock like COVID at dates here at, I think, date 10 or something like that, like 40% of the original endowment gets wiped out. What happens in this case? The government has borrowed to the hilt, so there will be a painful debt default. So you can see that the loss of endowment is actually far in excess of 40%. And then what happens is that the economy will gradually recover, but it will only recover to the worst steady state that it had, because the endowment is now even lower, and therefore there is no hope of actually breaking the trap and going somewhere else. So what could be done for such countries? It could be that multilateral agencies could give them some debt relief in order to minimize the default costs. And maybe you monitor the usage of the debt relief, because the debt relief would mean that additional debt capacity is available, which is not for repaying the legacy debt. And maybe you could target these governments to spend this on necessary healthcare and fiscal support measures. Why is the targeting necessary? Because our view is that the reason why these governments were in this trap in the first place is because they were not doing the expenditures in a particularly useful manner. And I want to stress this, that just debt relief in our model doesn't work. All that the debt relief does is allows the incumbent government to siphon off more resources. Now, perhaps what is more interesting is that if you had a relatively healthy economy, so it's at a higher steady state before the COVID shock, and let's say it gets a shock, this economy may not necessarily default on its debt, but because the endowment has now actually moved to a much lower level, these economies may now enter a repressive pattern of government behavior. Nothing changes as far as governments is concerned. What has changed is the starting level of endowments, which has reduced the ability of the governments in future to repay the debts. And as a result, you will now start seeing repressive behavior, and now you could get stuck actually in the steady state W. So people ask, oh, can developed economies just go and borrow to the hilt? Of course, they can borrow to the extent that the external markets allow them to. Will that be necessarily value enhancing? Our model says no. If the endowment shock turns up to be so large that these governments start engaging in financial repression that we are generally used to seeing in emerging markets. And at least Raghu, Jack, and I think this could be a serious risk for some of the countries out there. So I think this is the big question. Will the developed economies, once they see large shocks, behave as though they are developing economies? Yes, they could, if they need now commitment to show to the markets that we will repay the debts in future. And to do that, they might engage in various kinds of repression. In India, this was achieved through SLR requirements. It's achieved through telling LIC and pension funds to invest in government paper. This could very much become a possible behavior in developed economies as well if public indebtedness becomes very large. What's crucial is that this could lead to a growth trap. And I think that's what I'll just end with that.
Okay, great. Thanks, Ram. So we have now about maybe 5 minutes for questions.
Viral, may I ask one question?
Yeah, of course, please.
So as you said that you are not modeling the political economy of this in the sense that there are competing parties which are trying to gain the position of the government.
Mm-hmm.
But if you were to hazard a guess, like if you wanted to do such an exercise, like there are different political parties but similar objectives, like the one you have here. I mean, they are supposed to siphon off either way, whoever is in charge.
Exactly.
Then how much will be the severeness of these conclusions get affected in the process?
I think it doesn't. In fact, I think you said exactly what I was going to say. I think my conclusion is that the economic outcomes don't change terribly under different governments if the initial conditions of the economy don't change. And, they end up, the political economy happens on non-economic issues, completely irrelevant for the
Because they
economy.
are similar in other terms, right? I
Yeah,
mean,
exactly,
different names
exactly.
for
And
the same
so,
person.
in a way, it's a slightly cynical view of growth, which basically says is that, if for some reason you end up in a period where you don't get COVID-style shocks or you don't get global financial crisis kind of shocks, then because the endowments will be growing, you might end up somewhere on a good path. But once a bad shock happens, you have the inherent problems because you have not actually fixed the governance of your governments. But I think if I could just segue from that into something I couldn't cover, what we spend a little bit of time in the paper then is to think about some institutions. So one important institution is a debt ceiling, or like FRBM kind of targets. And to the extent that they are enforceable, they would have a lot of bite in the growth trap region. Because once you divorce the capacity of the government to alter its debt capacity from its policies, so because they can't really go beyond a point, they can't affect their debt capacity with their choices because they are not allowed to go beyond a certain point, so they don't engage in repression. Now, of course, as we know from the history of FRBM targets in India, which is that if these targets are very porous and unenforceable in the first place, then they will be relaxed. You will see repression along with the relaxation of these targets, and you will see underachievement of growth by the private sector, all happening together. Um, Second point, because what you need is the growth in the endowment of the households to create this lengthening impact of debt. What could work is actually if the government uses debt and it has commitment to make a fiscal transfer to just boost the endowment of the households. Because the government debt is just a technology to borrow against the future endowment. You can borrow against the future endowment, give it to the government, keep the government proceeds targeted to do a fiscal transfer to the households. All that you have done is just transferred household wealth from future to today. But the process of doing that can put the economy onto a better path. But what you need for that is a commitment that the proceeds from debt will be used for fiscal expenditures that are actually growth enhancing, that they are going into the pockets of the households rather than being wasted through some very localized allocations or just being siphoned off by the politicians. So I think in a way the model says that for economies to grow, we need to think hard about not just the financial development of the bond markets, because it could be a double-edged sword. You need to think about the governance of the government, which is when they have access to the debt market, how are you going to use the debt proceeds? Does it make sense to have strict enforcement of the debt ceilings at times? And that these might be the deeper ways that even without a change of the initial conditions, emerging economies can actually get out of their persistently slow growth regions. In fact, I think, again, I want to quote Dr. Rakesh Mohan again. He believes that one of the reasons why India is not hitting the growth targets that we want to achieve is because he thinks that the cycle of repression, low investments, low growth, and in turn, low endowments is actually creating a very perverse dynamic as far as these policy mix is concerned. And in fact, I think it was only when I started focusing more on emerging markets that I started seeing a focus on the savings rates. Even our analysts write a lot about being concerned that the savings rates are coming down. And why are they concerned? They are concerned because if the domestic savings come down, you will have to borrow more externally. Now, in a richer model than ours, that might mean that the lack of commitment implies actually a disproportionately high or convexly rising borrowing costs. And that in itself could become a poor situation, because with high repayment costs, you might see even further repression and you get like a bad trap again.
Viral, Abhirup here. So
Yes.
I just want, so I thought most of your model was made pretty much for a small open economy with some of these things, interest rates and so on, fixed from outside. When you actually talk about implications for developed countries, do you think that this is this is probably not a reasonable assumption, and then you have to worry about what happens to those things that you can take as given in the small open economy kind of framework?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. See, what happens basically is that actually, if you look at the original literature on financial repression, so you look at the empirical work of Carmen Reinhardt and others, they actually believe that capital controls are actually one of the foremost repressive tools. But we don't have a different currency between the economy and the outside world. But as I was saying briefly in the context of Argentina, that every time they have a debt problem, what you see is also a capital outflow. You see capital flight. Even depositors run on the domestic banks and they want to convert into dollars and put their savings abroad. And then to avoid that, of course, then you put massive capital controls in place to do that. And so I think without having modeled it explicitly, I think that the model actually does say that you would see capital controls as a repressive tool if there was a possibility of capital flight when you try to repress your economy. See, basically what have we assumed? What we have assumed is that you can tax the real sector investment and then there are no options left for the households, right? All that they can do is go into the government bond market. But we know that is not necessarily the case. They can pull their money out if they want, dump it in a Hawala market or whatever. And so I think that a richer model would actually tell you that an economy where the government is trying to repress the domestic savings so that it can keep its tap of debt going for its expenditures will actually use capital controls. And so whether an emerging market economy is open or not, and how open it is, may actually be endogenous to the sorts of considerations we have for debt dynamics of such a government.
Right. Thank you.
Okay, so we are basically out of time. So I want to thank Viral for a very, very interesting paper, and to all our participants for turning up. I guess if there are more questions that can be sent off on an email.
Yeah. Feel free to drop any questions or concerns by email, and I'll try to get to them as soon as possible.
All right.
Thank you very much again, Kanishka and Chetan, for arranging the seminar. It was a very stimulating discussion. Thank you all.
Not at all.
Thanks, Viral.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Viral, you want to talk briefly? We just
Yeah. Should I stay on the Zoom call, or you want to Skype, or?
let me call you on another Zoom. I'll just send you a
Okay, perfect.
invitation.
Yeah.
I'm gonna end the meeting now. So.
Okay.
Okay.
Have a good weekend, guys. Bye.
Thanks a lot.
Be safe. Bye.